Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. You're still watching the Breakfast Show live on Nile TV International. And as we mentioned earlier in our intro, we're going to be going back in history to talk more about our ancient Egyptian times. And this time we chose medicine to talk about medicine during the ancient Egyptian history. And on this issue, we're glad to be joined here at the studio by Mr. Ihab Kamel, Egyptologist and historian. Good morning, sir, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
A very good morning to you, sir. Medicine, science, the old Egyptians were very keen to be that much advanced in science and medicine and in many branches of knowledge in general. But let's talk about science and medicine, biology and medicine, all the medicine branches, if we may say, why they were that much into it in the first place. Is it to know more about the anatomy? Is it to know more about mummification? Is it to know more about the human being? What were the main reasons?
Well, let's first agree on one thing, that the ancient Egyptians' greatest discovery, it was agriculture. Mm-hmm. Usually when you discover agriculture and satisfy your basic needs, which are food, you start looking at other issues because you're already relaxed and secured. Yeah. The ancient Egyptian population was not very big, so the human being had a value because he had to cultivate the land to guarantee that the country's basic needs were secure. Mm-hmm. From this perspective, they had started looking at the well-being of the human being since a very early age. We can say comfortably since the beginning of the first dynasty. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, when we look behind, we will see that the ancient Egyptians had started their medical practices, whether if it was primitive or it was advanced, maybe even earlier than the first dynasty. Mm-hmm. Then when we look, we didn't know that the Egyptians were that advanced in medicine until we discovered the medical papyri, and this was in the 19th century. In 1862, when we discovered the Edwin Smith papyrus, which is consisting of 361 columns speaking about different remedies and different medical issues. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, we were surprised that most of these remedies were actually copied from earlier papyri dating back to the Old Kingdom. Mm-hmm. And most of the medical papyri which we have in hand nowadays, they are copied from earlier papyri, and you can say that their knowledge was accumulative, which they documented, and they were keen on documentation. The great surprise to us was actually the way they practiced medicine. Mm-hmm. You will notice that in these papyri, they are speaking about describing symptoms of diseases, mm-hmm. mentioning them, diagnosis, and even they used to have very, let's say, unorthodox methods in discovering diseases, like when they see a disease which they see for the first time, they keep examining the patient. If they cannot determine what kind of disease it is, they would put him in a public display in a market or near the gates of the town, so that the travelers coming from foreign countries would have a look at him and see if they have seen that disease before.
Like that before.
Yes, something like that before. And if they do, they ask them what kind of remedies they use, and there's someone who's dedicated to him. He is actually documenting what they are saying. So you can say that the way they practiced medicine was very modern, describing the disease, symptoms, diagnosis, which is the main protocol we use nowadays in practicing medicine. And usually the physicians were very well educated people. That's why they were usually priests. And the priests, they had practiced medicine, sometimes privately, and sometimes inside the temple in a special place which is like a clinic or the place where people come to this specific priest who is possessing the medical knowledge. And that is why later on we had started finding the name Sunu, which means a doctor. The strange thing that as early as the first dynasty, we had found female doctors carrying the name Sunut, which is like also a female physician. One of them was very famous. Her name was Paseshat in the 4th dynasty around the 26th century BC, was carrying the title of Emira Sunut, which means the chief physician. And even women, they had practiced medicine. Even they had specialists at certain times.
This was my coming question, because what you're saying, sir, is the general atmosphere regarding medicine, but as far as I know or understand that, they had specialities, meaning that the orthopedist was different than the gynecologist, different than the eye doctor. You know, they were that much sophisticated, even to have a doctor special in certain kinds of diseases, for example, and not to practice in other branches. Is that true, and when that started to happen?
Well, we believe that later on we started having specialities. It's natural that each priest, depending on different situations, he would face more cases than others. If he's close to, for example, to a desert area, and this town where he lives, it's always facing sandstorms and things that would affect the eyes, for example. He would see more eye diseases than others, so he would concentrate on that, and that, of course, builds knowledge, builds cumulative knowledge, and from there comes the speciality. Some others could be interested in a certain branch of medicine more than others. A bit by bit, this had started forming the specialities. Each doctor has his own specialty. This is an ophthalmologist, this is an orthopedic, this is a gynecologist, and this is something, this is a surgeon, and surgery was very important.
We are going to speak in detail about this.
And as a matter of fact, this had built a very strong network among the temples and among the clinics in the temples, which the people who were suffering from a certain disease, they can travel from one city to another in order to be treated, because they know that the doctors in this city, they treat this disease better than the others.
Right. Well, sir, you mentioned that they started practicing medicines very early in time, even before the first dynasty. And the doctors were mostly priests, and they were called sono. And they had specializations. So after all this, did they have colleges specialized to teach those doctors to have more specializations? Did they have certain curriculums to study?
Well, of course, yes. But of course, to be a doctor, that was not something easy. You had to pass by basic education, and you had to be on a very high moral level to be trusted in order to be given that medical education. The doctor,
they had colleges?
Not colleges, but they used to call it the houses of wisdom inside the temples. And of course, they used to assist the chief doctor or the priest who was responsible for this clinic. And there was a hierarchy. Each doctor has his own priests who assist him, especially when it comes to a branch like surgery, for example. And as I said, they had to be on a very high moral level. That's why most of the time the doctors were priests, because there was like a code of conduct or a code of ethics which they had practiced, and the people had to trust them with some of their secrets in order to be able to treat them. As you know, some diseases, for example, they needed a bit of secrecy. Like if someone was suffering from a venereal disease, for example, he could not say this in public because that would lead to his isolation from his own community. The public would actually take a side because they believe it's contagious or something like this. So the doctor had to respect the secrets,
privacy
of his own patient, which later on developed into the Hippocrates code of conduct, which the doctors nowadays they practice.
Yeah. Since we mentioned the surgeries, so the first operating table, it was purely Egyptian. When it was introduced, and what were the very first surgeries the old Egyptians had?
Well, let us say that the ancient Egyptians, before they started surgery, they studied anatomy, and of course that was through mummification.
Sure.
And you'd be surprised to know that they had described the functions of the different organs, not very different from what we know nowadays, with some mistakes that they, or some things that they did not discover. Like, for example, when we mentioned blood, they called that the blood is the magical fluid that carries the air, that carries the toxins away from the human body. The operating table was actually the same like the mummification table.
Yeah.
Mummification table, the mummification, it's a form of surgery but done after death.
Yeah.
Probably it dated back to a very early ancient Egyptian period, as early as the Old Kingdom. And we have in the Egyptian Museum a mummification table, which we believe that it's very much used for surgery as well. The ancient Egyptians, they had used surgery especially in accidents or in severe cases, and they classified the cases like cases which has to be operated immediately and it would work and the patient will be cured, and some cases they said no, he needs to be treated first to be able to stand the surgery. And some cases they said no, these are hopeless cases which surgery will not work, and this would be a torturing for the patient, and they would leave him to his own fate.
Right. Well, sir, just allow us to go to this short break and we'll be right back to resume the rest of the segments of the Breakfast Show.
Returning back to this magic civilization and to only one branch, medicine. And we are very much delighted to continue with our dear guest live here in the studio, Mr. Ihab Kamel, our researcher. Sir, I think it's really amazing to dive into this issue, and it's going to need more than one episode.
I believe so. It's something very profound, and the discoveries that we had discovered in this branch, and surprisingly that most of the medical, or lots of the medical papyri were discovered in Asasif, where they discovered the latest cachet a couple of weeks ago.
About 30 coffins.
Yes. Yeah. And many of the medical papyri were discovered in Asasif, and that indicates that there were physicians' tombs located around there. Surprisingly, when you look at even the doctors at that time, the doctor was also the man who made the prescription, not only read the prescription, he also prepared the prescription. But the prescription was not like today a medicine, it was more like a nutrition. Like, for example, for certain intestinal cases, they used to boil the roots of the pomegranate. And by the way, it still works up till nowadays. And they used to give it to the patient, and they tell him you have to boil the pomegranate skin or the roots, and that is to clear his intestines from some diseases. Actually, you will notice that the ancient Egyptians, when they practiced medicine, they looked at it with a very profound look. For example, when we talk about surgery, we cannot talk about surgery without talking about anesthetics. What did they use as an anesthetic? Actually, from lots of the scenes on the walls of the tombs, you will notice that the poppy flower, it
was used instead of anesthesia?
It's shown over there. Yes, poppy, that's opium.
Yes. So they used to give this instead of giving
anesthetic. Actually, they used to have two kinds of surgeries, minor surgeries and major surgeries. As a very fine example for minor surgeries, circumcision. Circumcision was done after the person had reached puberty. Of course, it's very painful, so they used to give him a painkiller.
What was the painkiller?
The painkiller is something that they had obtained from something called the Memphis stone. Memphis stone is a kind of very pure kind of alabaster like telecom, and they mixed it with vinegar to produce an impure form from carbonic acid, which would help in killing the pain, at least for a while, as they did this minor surgery. In major surgeries, they had used proper anesthetics, especially when it comes to bone fractures. And most of the fine examples of surgeries that we had seen on the mummies, they were actually orthopedic surgeries. In one of them, we had found that they had a nail made of gold to treat a bone fracture, which was something very strange. They used the nail just to treat the broken bone, and using the nail out of gold. Gold, as we all know, it's
not an active metal.
It's not an active metal. It does not oxidize.
Yeah.
So
it's not going to make
any side effects, any infections, does not lead to any body infections which would lead to a gangrene or so.
So they used the natural resources in every piece of, instead of medicine. I mean, instead of drugs, instead of chemicals, they used the natural resources. But what was the alternative to X-rays and the lab analysis to discover the disease itself?
What we call nowadays the clinical diagnosis. He can tell by testing the patient, or if he looks at the bone fracture, he can tell exactly how it looks like, which the early generations of doctors nowadays they used to practice before the modern technology was interfered, but actually with the experience they were able to know exactly. And in 90% of the cases, especially in bone fractures, the diagnosis was correct and their treatments were effective.
Yeah, and they also were very much advanced in knowing, for example, in gynecology, to decide the sex of the baby with, or this is what we knew from the papyrus, to know if this woman is going to have children in the first place or no. And by the way, if my information is right regarding the use of many of the old prescriptions till the moment with Egyptians, as far as I know, for example, that the old Egyptians made eye drops of the blue vitriol, which we call tutia in the countryside, until the moment some of these prescriptions are used. How did they know, for example, that this ingredient or this substance is going to make a difference?
But by trial or error, maybe?
Trial and error?
Trial and error.
Definitely.
We haven't got any solid evidence.
And because of this, I wanted to ask, have they tried this on animals, for example? Did they have animals in the lab, or these experiences were made on volunteers, for example?
Well, let me put the answer in one word. The need of the patient. A patient that comes and he's suffering from a case and he has no other alternative but
so they try
to accept the experiment. But animals? No. They wouldn't try on animals.
This is it. Because as far also as I know, that one of the most important questions which any human being should be asked, have you hurt an animal? Or if he said no, then he is not going to paradise or to heaven at all in the other world, according to those who lived here thousands of years ago.
Yes, that's actually mentioned in the negative confessions. But let me tell you that the Cahoon papyrus, which was discovered near Lahoun by Sir Flinders Petrie in the 19th century, actually part of it, it's speaking about veterinary medicine, which is a solid proof that not only the sacred animals in the temples were treated medically, but anyone who had an animal and he wanted to save his animal, because for a farmer this is part of his assets.
Yeah, sure.
He can go to the temple
source of living.
Treat that animal. So in this papyrus we have a special sector for veterinary medicine.
Right. As we said, they used or derived most of their medicines from the natural resources and herbals. So how far were they educated in this part? I mean, did they have specializations, or people specialized in producing medicines or certain types of, like for example, anesthesia? Did they have, did they manufacture this in special places?
Well, let me say that the doctor, he's the one who had run all the show. He's the one who diagnosed, treated, as well as he's the one who made the medicine as well. Of course, they studied the properties of the herbs and the plants and the metals as well, very well. Because one of the treatments that they had treated, for example, for trachoma, for example, that was actually malachite. Malachite, that is a semi-precious stone, which they...
The green one,
yes,
right? Malachite
they
is
used
the
to
green
grind
stone.
it and make it as a powder and made an ointment from it. And actually it was a kind of giving an immunity in special times or special seasons, especially the spring, against the trachoma, because they noticed that in this particular season, the eye infections gets to be more than any other season.
So they used the malachite as
The
a powder
malachite, yes.
to treat
Which we
the
now
eye.
are saying it's the healing of with crystals, in a way.
No, it's actually something very protective, and
Healing with
it
crystals.
has a very strong effect against inflammations, eye inflammations and infections. And you'd be surprised, how did they use the eye drops? They actually used to use a falcon's feather.
Yeah.
They dip the falcon's feather in the eye drop, and they would leave the drop to go through it, and it goes into the eye. And this shows that even they understood what is the meaning of the dose. The dose. It's a drop.
Yeah.
You only need a drop. So to guarantee that he would get the right dose, they had used this. Maybe
Using
it's a bit
garlic and
primitive.
onion
And this
as
was
antibiotics,
depicted
for
in their pictures. I mean, this kind of thing was depicted in their pictures on the temples.
Oh yes, yes. Many of their
Like
their
using the
techniques.
feather as an eye drop.
In one of the tombs, you will notice that they are showing a way of treating a dislocated shoulder by resting the elbow of the patient on a solid surface, and the physician is holding the wrist and pulling the shoulder into the right place. This is what we nowadays use. It's the same technique. We know it by the name of Kocher's method for treating the dislocated shoulders. It's exactly the same thing.
Centralization. What did they know about sterilization? How did they use the tools they had in the surgeries? Because many of the surgeries were made by tools. We still use similar tools to the moment. And regarding also the stitches, which the thread itself, which was made of the intestines of the cats. And even there was one of the commercials regarding some of these threads, and it had King Tut's mosque. It said that other threads were made since King Tut. Now we do have most modern techniques. This ad, it made the things on the contrary, made this thread not popular at all, because it was said that, oh, you said that the oldest is still till the moment used, but your thread, we don't know if it's going to continue or no.
Yes, this is true. However, when it comes to surgery, you have to notice that the cases throughout the history are the same. For example, when it comes to amputation, for example, you have to use a heavy tool. But of course, when you look at the saws that they had used, they are exactly the same like the saws we use nowadays for amputation, because at the end it has to be quick, it has to be with less pain and less suffering for the patient, especially that we believe that the anesthetics, no matter how long they had extended, still the time, with the effective time for them, it's quite short. So the surgery has to be efficient, had to be quick. And that is why they had worked their minds into creating tools that would facilitate this process as they are operating. They used scalpels, and the surgery tools seen on the walls, on the wall of the temple of Komombo, it's up till now showing knives, showing scalpels, showing forceps, which they had used in surgeries in order to make the surgery efficient and quick. And also this shows how the welfare of the patient was something very important in the mind, in the back of the mind of the doctor.
Right. I would like to thank you very much for the interesting and valuable insight, Mr. Ihab Kamel, Egyptologist and historian. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being with us, sir, and have a very good day. And by this, we come to the end of this episode of our breakfast show. Today is another day, another episode, and another crew. You were in the company of my dear colleague, Naveen Ramzi, and myself, Nermina Abdurrahman. Thank you, Naveen.
Thank you very much, Nermina.